What if the biggest threat to Mark Grayson isn't the Viltrumites invading Earth, but the unsettling possibility that he is slowly becoming his father? As Nolan sheds his ruthless alien dogma to embrace humanity, Mark is pushed into brutal choices that force us to ask a terrifying question. Is the son destined to become the very tyrant he fought to destroy? Before we unravel where Mark and Nolan are truly heading, keep in mind this video contains general spoilers for the Invincible series. To understand why Mark's moral decay is even a possibility, we first have to examine the terrifying worldview that molded his father, absolute social Darwinism. The Viltrumite Empire was built on a single uncompromising law: only the strong deserve to live, and the weak are merely collateral damage. This philosophy reached its absolute peak during the Great Purge, a catastrophic civil war where Viltrumites slaughtered half of their own population just to eliminate any trace of physical weakness. In their eyes, this culling created the ultimate species, but it also birthed a massive structural flaw. An empire built purely on violence lacks the capacity for mercy, diplomacy, or growth. Nolan lived by this brutal code for thousands of years, treating empathy as a defect. Yet on Earth, something broke inside him. As Nolan begins to unlearn centuries of brainwashing, Mark finds himself shoved into impossible moral corners where holding on to his humanity might cost him everything he loves, setting the stage for a tragic role reversal. Nolan's shift begins the exact moment he abandons his mission on Earth. For thousands of years, he viewed emotions as an evolutionary defect, something that only weak, lesser species allowed themselves to feel. But his time with Debbie and Mark quietly cracked that foundation, forcing him to confront a reality the Viltrumites fought so hard to erase. Love isn't a vulnerability, it's a terrifyingly powerful motivator. When Nolan flees to Thraxa, we don't see a conquered planet ruled by a cold tyrant. We see a man desperate for redemption, building a new family and stepping up to protect them from his own people. By refusing to murder Mark on Earth and choosing to fight his fellow Viltrumites on Thraxa, Nolan directly violates his empire's core mandate, prioritizing connection over cold, calculated duty. This creates a profound irony in Nolan's journey. The man who once slaughtered the guardians of the globe without blinking is slowly learning what it actually means to be human. He is unlearning centuries of indoctrination piece by piece, proving that even the most hardened imperial soldier can be broken by genuine empathy. But while Nolan moves toward light and connection, Mark is pushed in the complete opposite direction. While Nolan is beginning his path toward redemption, Mark is forced to confront the brutal realities of the world he swore to protect. Being a hero in the Invincible universe isn't a glossy comic book fantasy. It is a series of traumatic choices where trying to do the right thing often leads to catastrophic loss. Time and time again, Mark tries to hold on to his moral code by showing mercy to his enemies. But every time he holds back, innocent people pay the price with their lives. Whether dealing with villains like Angstrom Levy or relentless threats that refuse to stop, Mark starts to realize that absolute pacifism in a ruthless world comes with a body count. This constant trauma begins to chip away at Mark's youthful idealism. He stops asking, "What is the noble thing to do?" and starts asking, "What needs to be done to ensure everyone survives?" This subtle shift from idealistic hero to cold pragmatist is the first dangerous step onto the exact path his father walked for centuries. Mark's turning point isn't marked by a sudden desire for power. It is forged through absolute psychological and physical devastation. When Angstrom Levy threatens his family, dragging Mark across dimensions and torturing his mother, Mark is pushed past his absolute limit. Up until this point, Mark's heroic identity relied on the belief that there is always another way, a clean solution where the hero saves everyone without sacrificing his soul. But Levy forces Mark into an inescapable corner where mercy equals the death of those he loves. When Mark finally unleashes his full force, beating Levy to a bloody pulp, it isn't just an act of survival, it is the death of his innocence. He realizes with horror that when pushed far enough, he possesses the exact same terrifying capacity for unbridled, destructive violence as his father. The true tragedy of Mark Grayson isn't that he kills, but what that kill does to his psyche. Unlike Nolan, who executed entire populations with cold, bureaucratic detachment, Mark is left completely shattered by his own actions. He strands himself in a desolate wasteland covered in blood, crying out in utter agony over what he has become. This moment exposes the central paradox of his trajectory. Mark desperately fears becoming Omni-Man, yet the universe continuously forces him into situations where acting like Omni-Man is the only way to protect Earth. Every violent act chips away at his sense of self, leaving him infected with a quiet, creeping cynicism. If Levy was the crack in Mark's moral foundation, the arrival of Conquest is the hammer that shatters it entirely. Conquest represents the ultimate unvarnished truth of the Viltrumite Empire, a monster who fights not out of duty or ideology, but for the sheer sadistic pleasure of slaughter. When facing an entity of pure, unreasoning destruction, Mark's lingering hopes of diplomacy or restraint are brutally dismantled. Conquest doesn't care about justice, redemption, or human life. He only understands overwhelming force. To defeat him, Mark has to headbutt a godlike entity into a gory mass, ignoring his broken bones and tearing himself apart just to inflict lethal damage. The battle with Conquest forces Mark to accept a horrifying reality. Holding on to a strict moral code against monsters who have none isn't heroic. It's suicidal. Mark begins to adopt a terrifyingly pragmatic stance. He realizes that if he lets a merciless enemy live out of moral purity, every future life that enemy takes is directly on his hands. This is the exact moment Mark's philosophy shifts from, "I won't kill because it's wrong," to "I will kill if it means saving the people I care about." It is a dark, cold logic, and it is precisely the kind of rationale his father used for centuries. What makes this story arc so profound is how Mark and Nolan cross paths in completely opposite directions. Nolan starts at the absolute peak of cold Viltrumite tyranny, a living weapon who sees human existence as fleeting and irrelevant. Over time, he descends into vulnerability, embracing empathy, remorse, and the terrifying weight of love. Meanwhile, Mark begins as a bright-eyed, compassionate teenager who believes every life is precious, only to be systematically dragged down into the cold, brutal realities of absolute war. As Nolan actively tries to dismantle the bloodthirsty legacy he helped build, he discovers that escaping his past is almost impossible. The guilt of his crimes on Earth haunts every choice he makes. Yet, while Nolan is desperately striving to act more like a compassionate human, Mark is forced to act more like a calculating soldier. Mark finds himself standing over fallen enemies, making the exact kind of ruthless life-or-death calls that Nolan used to make without a second thought. It is a heartbreaking role reversal. The monster is learning to feel, while the boy is learning to harden his heart. Both characters are caught in a web of tragic ironies. Nolan believed that suppressing his emotions made him invincible, only to realize that his love for his family was the only thing that gave his life real meaning. Mark believed that his humanity would keep him grounded, only to discover that protecting humanity requires him to make monstrous compromises. Mark isn't changing because he wants power or control. He is changing because the sheer weight of his responsibilities leaves him no other choice. This trajectory brings us back to the ultimate question that hangs over the entire story. Is Mark Grayson genuinely turning into his father? The answer is both yes and no. Pragmatically, Mark is adopting the brutal methods of Omni-Man out of sheer necessity to survive and protect Earth. But morally, the reason he does it remains fundamentally different. Nolan killed out of allegiance to an oppressive empire. Mark kills out of a desperate, protective devotion to the people he loves. He is adopting his father's violence, but fueled by his mother's heart, making his transformation not a fall into evil, but a tragic sacrifice of his own moral purity. So, is Mark Grayson truly destined to become the monster he fought to defeat, or is Nolan becoming more human than his son? The answer lies in how both characters redefine what it actually means to be strong. Mark is not turning into a cold, conquest-driven villain like his father once was, nor is Nolan completely erasing the blood on his hands. Instead, they are meeting in a tragic middle ground, one where survival demands brutal compromises, but love prevents total corruption. The central tragedy of Invincible is that protecting the world forces you to shed your innocence. Nolan thought strength meant absolute emotional suppression and total physical dominance. His journey proves that bearing your humanity makes you fragile to the things that truly matter. Mark, on the other hand, starts with total moral purity but learns that absolute pacifism in the face of annihilation is an impossible luxury. He adopts his father's willingness to do whatever it takes, but grounds it entirely in his mother's empathy. Mark Grayson isn't inheriting his father's cruelty, he is inheriting his father's burden. He carries the terrifying responsibility of godlike power in a world that constantly tests his soul. He might cross lines he swore he would never cross, and he might carry permanent emotional scars from the blood on his hands, but as long as he fights out of love rather than empire, he will never truly be Omni-Man. At the end of the day, Invincible shows us that becoming strong isn't about hiding your weaknesses, it's about facing impossible choices and living with the consequences. What do you think? Is Mark slipping too far into his father's violent ways? Or is this just the price of being Earth's last line of defense? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more breakdown videos on Invincible and your favorite series. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.